Hello, I'm Keith Hocton. This morning you find me exactly where you'd want to be if you had only one day in Paris, at a little street cafe shaded beneath a canopy of leaves, the sky above a perfect Mediterranean blue. Life here in Montmartre moves at its own tempo, slow, unhurried, with that gentle clatter of cups and saucers that's been part of this neighborhood's soundtrack for centuries. I'm lingering over my coffee, watching Paris drift past. And as I sit here, I can't help thinking that Van Gogh, Picasso, Renoir, they too would have sat on these cobbled streets, sketchbooks in hand, eyes flickering from their absinthe to the bustling life around them. Montmartre has always been a stage for art and for artists, and today it still wears its past like a badge of honor. So why am I here? Do I need an excuse? Hardly. Life is too short. Life is beautiful. And in the height of summer, where else would you want to be but Paris, the city of lovers, of poets, and of those frustrated generals who marched in only to find the city had a mind of its own. Now, if you flicked on this podcast, you're like me, a fellow traveler who doesn't want to just stroll through history, but to actually understand it. Someone who wishes there were more plaques, more stories pinned to the very walls of the buildings that I walk by. That's what I'm going to do together with you today. We're heading first off to one of the great cathedrals of the world, perhaps the cathedral, Notre Dame. Its Gothic towers rising 70 meters into the Parisian sky, its bells immortalized by Victor Hugo in A Tale of a Hunchback and a Gypsy Girl. But before that, let me finish this last sip of coffee and then we'll walk down towards the Seine, past the bright lights of the Moulin Rouge, into the very heart of the city, because that's where it all began, on this little island in the river, the Ile de la Cité, the cradle of Paris. Stand here and you're standing on history so densely packed, it's a wonder that we're allowed to walk over it, if at all. This was where Julius Caesar planted Rome's standard. This is also where the Vikings attacked with their longships, where generations of Parisians built, prayed, and defended. And it's here above all that Notre Dame rises, a stone witness to the centuries of triumph and tragedy. And if you let your imagination run wild just for a moment, you might also picture Ragnar Lothbrok, that semi-mythical Viking raider beaching his longship here. This little island has been visited by the great and the mighty of Europe, Richard the Lionheart, William the Marshal, Louis XVI. Napoleon actually crossed these bridges on his way to crown himself emperor, and Charles de Gaulle came here in 1944 to celebrate the liberation of Paris. Today, of course, the island is dominated by Notre Dame. It isn't just the Cathedral of Paris, it's a symbol, or the symbol of Paris, actually. Since the fire in 2019, when the world held its breath as flames, consumed the roof and the spire, it has become something more. I think it's become a monument not only to Gothic genius, but to the resilience of the Parisians themselves. Stand in the great square before the western facade, and you see what generations have seen. Those twin towers rising 70 meters into the sky, the magnificent rose window glowing like a jewel in its stone frame, the famous gargoyles grinning down at the crowds, and what crowds they are. Tourists craning their necks, cameras pointing upwards, all of them dwarfed by the scale of the building itself. Every stone, every arch, every carving is a page in the history book of Paris. For more than 850 years, this church has stood at the very center of French history. It has seen coronations, revolutions, the rise and fall of dynasties, the devastation of wars, and the dramas of restoration. If there is a single heart to Paris, this has to be it. And why here, you might ask? Because this is the Ile de la Cité, the birthplace of Paris itself. People actually settled here 2,500 years ago for the simplest of reasons, the river. Whoever controlled this island controlled the crossing. They could defend it, they could trade from it, they could tax those who used it. Julius Caesar dismissed it as a muddy little town that he conquered, but he also recognized its strategic value. The Romans built here, and so then did the kings of France. For 1,000 years, this island was the seat of power. The royal palace stood here until the monarchs moved it to the Louvre in the 14th century. Alongside the palace, you would have found the Hôtel Dieu, the city's first hospital, and the early instruments of royal administration. And of course, at the center of it all stood the great cathedral. Even today, if you want to see a fragment of medieval Paris, you need to only wander the streets on the left bank. One of the oldest houses still standing is that of Nicholas Flamel. I did a podcast on him earlier in the year. Yes, the same Nicholas Flamel who has a walk-on part in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Look, in real life, he was a medieval alchemist, credited with discovering the Philosopher's Stone. His house still exists, and today it's a restaurant. I love this about Paris, and Paris is like that. It's a city where layers of history remain visible and sometimes edible. But I have to say, the true survivor, the colossal presence beside me now, is Notre Dame itself. Construction actually began in the 1160s, urged on by the Bishop of Paris and financed by the king. And like all great medieval cathedrals, it was never the work of a single generation. It rose slowly over the centuries, each layer of stone placed by hands long turned to dust. Each sculpture carved by men who never lived to see the cathedral finished. What we see today is not only a triumph of engineering and artistry, it's a monument to human persistence across time. To fully understand Notre Dame, you have to understand the Paris of the 12th and 13th centuries. This was no longer just a muddy backwater clinging to its little island in the Seine. Paris was exploding in wealth, in ambition, in sheer numbers. By the 1300s, it held around 25,000 people, making it the largest city in Northern Europe, second only to the mighty cities of Italy. And of course, with people came pressure. Pressure for space, for grandeur, for moments that reflected the city's new stature. The old cathedral was simply too small, a village chapel in a metropolis in the making. Think of it as football supporters cramming into a ground that's, suddenly too tight for them all. Just as Arsenal outgrew Highbury, and moved to the Emirates, Paris needed something bigger, grander, something more fitting. Notre Dame was built to hold 5,000 worshippers at once, a staggering capacity for the age. After only 70 years, enough of the building was complete for services to be actually held inside. But the work didn't stop there, far from it. With every new decade came new techniques, new craftsmanship, and above all, new money. For this was a city on the rise. Territories like Normandy were absorbed into the royal estates, pouring wealth into Paris. And as the coffers swelled, so did the cathedral, growing ever more elaborate, ever more ambitious, ever more beautiful. This wasn't just about religion. It was politics, it was theatre, and it was a spectacle. For centuries, the kings of France had been more like feudal overlords than emperors. Their vassals, the great barons and the dukes, guarded their independence jealously. But by the 13th century, the monarchy was on the march. More land meant more power, and Notre Dame, rising stone by stone on the Ile de la Cité, was the perfect symbol of that power. Think of Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. If you've read it or seen the TV adaptation, you'll remember the point the hammers struck home. Cathedrals were not just places of prayer. They were statements of wealth, of authority, and certainly statements of ambition. Their very scale was a form of propaganda. You could see them for miles, towers breaking through the mist, spires floating above the clouds. And that was deliberate. They were being built to astonish. And Notre Dame was nothing if not innovative. Look at the western facade today. The base is squat, very fortress-like, reminiscent more of a castle wall than of the soaring Gothic we associate with cathedrals. But as your eyes climb upwards, the styles evolve. Arches lift, carvings multiply, windows bloom. And by the time you reach the transepts, those great arms flung out across the city, you're looking at the cutting edge of medieval architecture. This wasn't just a building, this was revolution in stone. And what I love about Notre Dame is that it isn't just one building frozen in time. It's actually the sum of centuries. Look closely at the facade and you can literally read in every stone. At the bottom, the heavy arches of the early Gothic. As your eyes climb upwards, the styles evolve. More light, more grace, more daring. Until at the very top, you are looking at the high Gothic in all its splendor. It is a building that wears the fingerprints of many generations. And I have to say, if it dazzles us today, just imagine how it must have stunned a medieval visitor. A farmer trudging in from the countryside for the first time, or even a Parisian used to the cramped streets and timber houses of the city. Nothing else would have come close. Notre Dame dwarfed everything around it, a giant rising out of a jumble of 3 or 4 or maybe 5-story wooden houses crammed behind city walls. For medieval Paris was dense, it was cramped, and it was filthy. People lived cheek by jowl. There was no space to waste and no sewage system worth the name. So, as you might guess, the streets were open drains. Household waste, scraps, animal dung, chamber pots, all flung out of the window and left to find their way eventually into the river. And you would have walked the streets very carefully, always hugging the walls, never the middle, because in the middle you risked a very unwelcome gift falling on your head. The French even have a saying that comes from this, tenir le haut du pavé, literally to keep to the high part of the pavement. To hold the higher ground was to keep your dignity, your status, and also, quite literally, your cleanliness. The poorer folk had to give way to step into the middle of the muck. Status wasn't just about wealth or titles, it was about where you stood when two people passed each other in the street. And the smell? Oh my goodness. Imagine tanneries working their hides by the river, butchers washing out their waste, every trade pouring its refuge into the Seine. For us today, it actually sounds horrific. By comparison, the industrial river of the 1970s, clogged with chemicals and oil, it might have actually been more poisonous, but in the Middle Ages, the stench alone would have been overwhelming, and there were people who actually passed out from it. That's how strong this was. Yet, there is one thing the Parisians could be thankful for, the Seine itself. It's no sluggish river. Its strong current kept the filth moving, flushing it downstream. And that actually saved the city from the worst of its own waste. And today, believe it or not, after centuries of pollution and cleanup, the Seine is clear enough that Parisians are once again opening it for swimming. A return, perhaps, to a very different sort of river life. Stand before the western front of Notre Dame and you see why it has been called one of the most famous facades in the world. At its center, the Great Rose Window, a kaleidoscope of colored glass framed by stone tracery so fine it seems almost weightless. Around it, row upon row of carvings, saints, apostles, prophets, figures frozen in time, watching as centuries of Parisians and travelers pass beneath them. And along the Gallery of Kings, just above the great doors, are statues that once caused a terrible misunderstanding. They are the kings of Judea, the biblical rulers from the Book of Kings. But in 1793, in the fury of the French Revolution, people actually mistook them for the kings of France. And in a burst of kind of revolutionary zeal, they actually dragged them down, smashed them to pieces, and hurled them into the gutters. It was only later that the error was actually realized. Today, the fragments of those medieval statues lie in the Museum of Medieval Art in Paris, a place well worth visiting if you want to see the real survivors of Notre Dame. Then, of course, you have the gargoyles, those stone monsters leering from the towers, jaws wide, claws gripping the parapets. The very word comes from the French gargouille, a throat, a gurgle, the sound of water being swallowed, because that is what they were built to do, to drain the rainwater, to carry it away from the delicate stonework, so that the facade was spared from damage. Paris's limestone is beautiful, but it's fragile too. It crumbles easily under the twin assaults of water and pollution. The gargoyles were not there just for decoration. They were the guardians of the stone. And yet, they're also more than just plumbing. They are pure theatre. Medieval people adored monsters, grotesques, and hybrids that filled their manuscripts and their churches. The gargoyles were guardians, scaring off evil spirits with faces more devilish than the devil himself. They gave the cathedral a supernatural skin, half holy, half hellish, reminding everyone that salvation and damnation were only a heartbeat apart. And look down to the great doors where the iron curls and twists like ivy across the oak. These hinges are so intricate, so impossibly fine, that medieval Parisians were convinced no human hand could have forged them. And of course, out of that grew one of the city's favorite legends. The young blacksmith, desperate to prove himself, approached the master of works, who then set him a challenge to forge the entire ironwork for the cathedral doors in one single night. You would think it would be an impossible task, but the boy, hot-headed and daring, said he could do it. As the hours wore on, his strength gave out. Despairing, he muttered to himself, "I'll never do it." And when a man says that, the devil is often listening. In the dead of the night, the tempter appeared. He offered his bargain. "I will give you the skill to make the ironwork, the like of which the world has never seen. But I ask only one small thing, your soul." The boy agreed. By morning, the doors gleamed with intricate vines and flowers wrought in iron, so fine, so impossibly delicate, that all of Paris marveled. The people praised the boy as a genius, as a prodigy, but when the devil returned for payment, the boy fled into the cathedral. The devil, they say, cannot pass its threshold. So the smith lived out his days inside Notre Dame, safe from damnation, but condemned never to leave. Some even whisper that Victor Hugo drew on this tale when he imagined his hunchback, a man bound to the cathedral forever, both sanctuary and also prison. And so, with the devil's iron still curling across the doors, we're about to step inside. The first thing that strikes you is the nave. Long, soaring, breathtaking. The word comes from the Latin navis, meaning ship, and as you tilt your head back, you see why. The vaulting above you is like the ribs of a vast wooden hull, an arc turned upside down, if you like. Light drifts through the celestiary windows, soft and colored, filling the space with a holy dusk. Then there's the transept, the arms of the church, turning the building into the shape of a cross. But look closely and you'll see something unusual. Notre Dame is not perfectly straight. Stand in the nave and you'll notice the axis bends slightly as it moves towards the choir. Why? Was it the awkward shape of the island? Was it an error in calculation, perhaps? Or was it a deliberate, a symbolic echo of Christ's head leaning to one side on the cross? No one actually knows, but the tilt is there, subtle and undeniable, like the cathedral's own scar. And this interior, this theatre of stone, has bore witness to the great dramas of France. Think of it, 8.5 centuries of history under these vaults. I have to say, my own favourite moment, a sliding doors moment if there ever was one, came in 1431, when a boy of 10 was brought here to be crowned. His name was Henry, son of England's Henry V, heir to both kingdoms by treaty. And on that day, he was proclaimed Henry VI of England and Henry II of France. And for a moment, it seemed as if England and France might be bound forever under one crown. But history, as so often, has other ideas. This would have been a heartbeat of history, the crowns of both nations resting on one child's head. Henry VI, son of Henry V, the victor of Agincourt, and grandson of Charles VI of France. His mother was French. His bloodline straddled the Channel. He was the living embodiment of the union of two kingdoms that had so often been at war. I think had things gone differently, history might have been kinder. One great happy family united under a single crown rather than centuries of rivalry and war. But history rarely deals in happy families, does it? Because the truth is, the moment of triumph was an illusion. The boy's French grandfather was Charles VI, known as the Beloved and later the Mad. Medieval Europe certainly didn't need one mad king, let alone two. Yet Henry inherited that very unstable legacy. And while his father had carved out glory on the battlefield, Henry VI proved one of the weakest rulers England would ever endure. And of course, in France, rising to meet him came a girl of just 15, Joan of Arc. To the English, she was a witch, a devil's servant. To the French, she was God's chosen saint. Both sides claimed heaven's blessing, which is always the problem with religious wars. Someone has to be wrong. But the Catholic Church later canonized her, which settles the argument, I suppose. Joan of Arc was the saint. Henry VI was the failure. And so, here in Notre Dame, we can feel those sliding doors of history creak on their hinges. England and France might have been one. Instead, what we get is the 100 Years' War, and it rumbled on, fueled by dynastic claims and divine visions, and the boy crowned in this cathedral would go down as one of the worst kings in English history. But Notre Dame has always been more than just a theatre for earthly politics. Step a little bit further inside, and you come across one of its most sacred treasures, the crown of thorns. It claims to be the very crown worn by Christ at his crucifixion, brought here in the 13th century by St. Louis, pious king, who bought it at a staggering cost and walked it into Paris barefoot, wearing only a simple shirt. Is it real? It depends what you believe. The faithful bow before it. Historians debate it. But look, whatever your conviction, if you come to see it, remember this. It is not a curiosity. It's a relic. It is displayed only on Friday afternoons. And when you stand before it, you're actually standing in the presence of centuries of devotion. And even if you doubt, respect those who believe, because here, belief has shaped the stones themselves. The crown of thorns is not something you can wander in and see at leisure. And at this moment in time, it's only displayed 2 hours each Friday afternoon. And I think it's a story, much else like in Notre Dame, that stretches back through centuries of faith and of empire. And I think it all begins with Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great, a passionate Christian, and in many ways, the first great archaeologist of faith. You know, she scoured the Holy Land for relics of Christ's passion. And the crown actually passed to Constantinople. It was kept for centuries until the Fourth Crusade turned that city upside down. Baldwin II, the Catholic ruler of Constantinople, beset on all sides by enemies and short of money, actually then pawned it to Venetian merchants. Word reached France that St. Louis, the pious king who would one day be canonized, might buy it. Louis did not hesitate. He actually paid the staggering sum of 22,000 livres, half the annual budget of his kingdom, to bring that relic to Paris. And because a treasure so holy needed a reliquary, he built one of the most exquisite chapels in the world. La Sainte-Chapelle, a jewel box of glass and stone designed to hold the crown like a great bejeweled chest. For centuries it remained there for royal eyes only. Not until the 19th century was it finally brought to Notre Dame, where it could be venerated by the public. And so it remains today, a relic of relics brought out each Friday, a fragment of the Passion itself displayed under the vaults of Paris. But Notre Dame is not only the stage for sacred relics, it is also the theatre of France's secular glory. Most famously, of course, in 1804, when Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French. You know the scene, Jacques-Louis David's vast painting, a canvas so large it almost swallows the Louvre gallery where it hangs, and it's definitely worthwhile going to see. And of course, there is Napoleon lifting the crown with his own hands, refusing to let the Pope place it on his head. The greatest power move, I think, in European history. And yet look closely and you'll see something odd. The cathedral in the painting doesn't quite look like Notre Dame at all. And David deliberately softened its Gothic lines, reshaping it into something more classical, so the eye would not be distracted from the central drama, which of course is Napoleon, Josephine, and the Pope kind of lurking awkwardly in the background. But one detail is true. If you look at the great Pieta in the painting, Mary cradling the dead body of her son, that is the same Pieta you can still see here today, glimmering in the half-light of the choir. I think it's worth remembering, too, that the cathedral Napoleon stood in looked very different to the one that we see now. For centuries, these Gothic walls were not bare stone, but they were actually alive with color. Murals blazed across the walls, saints, painted in reds and blues, stories unfurled across panels and pillars. Remember, most people in the Middle Ages couldn't read, and Latin, the language of mass, was a complete mystery to them. So the church was their Bible in stone and in paint, the colors shouting out stories of Christ and the saints. I think today we tend to imagine the Middle Ages as a very grey, gloomy, perpetually cold kind of place, a world of mud and darkness, like the bleakest, medieval film. But that's actually an illusion. Step into the mind of the medieval worshipper, and Notre Dame was a carnival of color, of music, and of light. A place actually designed to astonish, to take your breath away, to dazzle, to overwhelm you as you entered. It was never a ruin. It was a riot in the mind. And I think this brings us to another truth about Notre Dame. The building we see today is not the same one seen by medieval Parisians. Much of what we admire is actually the result of a sweeping reconstruction in the mid-19th century. The great restorer, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, and he rebuilt the cathedral almost from top to bottom. He tore away centuries of alterations, of additions, and layers that actually had accumulated since the first Gothic stones were laid. His vision was to return Notre Dame to its pure Gothic form, though in truth, he was not restoring so much as reimagining. What we admire as timeless medieval grandeur is, in large part, a 19th century reinvention. Before that, Notre Dame had been completely reshaped. In the reign of Louis XVI, for example, the Gothic pillars were smothered in marble and gold, hidden beneath the extravagance of the Baroque, which saw medieval simplicity as crude and ugly. Many of the statues inside were destroyed or spirited away, and what had once been a Gothic church of light and stone became, instead, a palace of gilt and grandeur. And you can still see traces of that today. Statues smothered in ornament that only really survived because they were too well hidden to destroy. But it was the French Revolution that brought Notre Dame to its lowest ebb. In the fury against the church and all it represented, this cathedral was stripped of all its symbols and all of its treasures were torn down. The Gallery of Kings outside, remember, it was mistaken for French monarchs, and smashed. Inside, the building was rededicated as a temple of reason. Imagine that. Sermons delivered not in praise of God, but of science, philosophy, and human reason. Robespierre himself listened to speeches under these vaults that rang not with chants, but with Enlightenment ideals. By 1795, Catholicism was officially banned. For a few brief years, Notre Dame was not a cathedral at all, but a civic temple to a new man-made faith. And yet, just a few years later, it became the stage for one of the most extraordinary coronations in European history. Napoleon understood symbols. He saw the power of this cathedral, the renaissance it carried, and he knew that to bind France back to Catholicism, it would be to strengthen his claim. In 1804, he invited the Pope to crown himself here in Notre Dame. The Pope, eager to reclaim France, the so-called eldest daughter of the church, gladly came. But at the crucial moment, as the crown was lifted, Napoleon seized it and placed it on his own head. And it was the greatest theatrical gesture of them all. And basically what he was saying, folks, is, I don't take my power from the Pope, I take it for myself. A church that had been a temple of reason only a decade before became once again the great stage of monarchy. Notre Dame has always been that, a building remade and repurposed, endlessly shifting to match the tides of history. The other thing to remember is that Notre Dame has never been static. Never. It has been attacked, it has been stripped, reshaped again and again across the centuries. And during the Reformation and the wars of religion in France, Protestant iconoclasts stormed into the cathedral, smashing Gothic treasures, tearing down images, vandalizing the symbols of papal splendor. Across the Channel, Cromwell's men were stabling horses in English cathedrals. Here in France, Huguenots struck down saints and altars, but their acts of destruction reverberated like terrorist attacks of the age. And of course, retaliation came swiftly. There were massacres, the most famous being the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where literally tens of thousands of Protestants were butchered. And of course, the stones of Notre Dame carried those scars as well. So when you walk inside Notre Dame today, you're not actually stepping into a building that Louis XVI saw, or Napoleon, or even Robespierre. You're walking into a building that has layer upon layer of history, each century scratching its mark on the very same walls. And by the early 19th century, that layering had left the cathedral tired, scarred, and a little bit neglected. Still the seat of the Bishop of Paris, yes, but shabby and crumbling, weighted with centuries of mismatched styles. And of course, this is where Victor Hugo enters the story. And his novel, Notre Dame de Paris, better known to us as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, appeared in 1831 for the first time. And it actually transformed how people saw the building. Victor Hugo turned the cathedral into a chapter as vivid, I think, as Quasimodo or Esmeralda. I think he infused it with romance and drama and also melancholy. And he made people care again. His novel was to Notre Dame what Treasure Island was to pirates. It actually fixed the image in the collective imagination. People no longer wanted a Notre Dame covered with the gilded plaster of Louis XVI or the reasoned abstractions of the Revolution. They wanted the original Gothic dream. And so, fired by this romantic vision of heritage, the French state called for a great restoration. And the man who answered that was the man that I mentioned to you before, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. And he wanted to create what he thought the Middle Ages should have looked like. Where there was no evidence, he conjured. When he added floral decorations to the pillars, he insisted that they were authentic, sometimes claiming to have discovered archaeological traces of them. And of course, in reality, much of it was just his fantasy. But it was fantasy rooted in scholarship and, I have to say, the most incredible passion. His boldest stroke, I think, personally, is the spire. There had once been a medieval spire, long lost. Leduc rebuilt it in his own style, using modern 19th century techniques, then justified himself with a flourish. And what he actually is quoted as saying is, if the medieval builders had known these methods, they would have used them. And so, the spire that burned in 2019, the spire that the world mourned, wasn't actually the medieval spire at all. It was a romantic reinvention born of the imagination of a 19th century restorer. In Britain, almost everything we think of as ancient was, in fact, touched up or remade by the Victorians. That's a fact. And it's oddly comforting, I think, to know that Paris too has its reinventions. Paris isn't going anywhere, folks, and there's plenty more to come. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altadomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altadomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So to finish this podcast off, if there is one moment when the world seemed to hold its breath for Notre Dame, it was the night of the 15th of April 2019. Of course, the great irony is that the fire began during restoration work on the spire itself. Early that evening, smoke was seen curling above the roof. Within minutes, flames tore through the timbers. These beams were not just old. They were ancient. These were actually oak that was cut in the Middle Ages, 8 centuries of dry wood piled high above the stone vaults. And of course, the blaze spread with terrifying speed. I wasn't in Paris at the time, but I watched it on TV, holding my breath. I saw people pouring into the streets. From every bridge, every square, every boulevard, you could see it. A cathedral on fire. The city stood in silence, watching as one of its defining landmarks burned. At first I thought, the stones are going to endure, they have to. But then came the fear that they might not. Stones can, of course, crack in heat as savage as this. And I then wondered, would the towers collapse? Would the vaults give way? And of course, then came the heroes. Firefighters rushing in, not to save people this time, but relics, artwork, treasures. The crown of thorns was carried out under falling debris. So too, the countless statues, the chalices, the priceless glass. They fought not only the flames, but time itself, working under a collapsing roof to save the soul of Paris. And of course, as it turned out, the roof was lost, the great spire fell, and the medieval furniture inside was, of course, reduced to ash. But much else survived. The windows darkened by smoke, well, they only needed cleaning. The stones, scorched, still held. In a strange way, the fire became an opportunity. For the first time since Dulac's restoration in the 1800s, the entire building could be examined, cleaned, renewed, and the cathedral emerged lighter, brighter, its stained glass shining with a clarity that hadn't actually been seen in centuries. Yet even in the ashes, there was debate. How should Notre Dame be rebuilt? Should a new glass spire rise in place of the old? Should steel and modern design enter where medieval stone once stood? Architects submitted radical proposals. A roof of light, a garden in the sky. President Macron promised the French would rebuild it, boldly and quickly, declaring, "We are a nation of builders." But the arguments actually turned fierce. They turned political, of course. And in the end, the decision was made to rebuild conservatively, to restore what had been lost rather than invent something entirely new. And work went on day and night. Donations flooded in from across the world, literally hundreds of millions, enough to summon the best craftsmen alive to work around the clock to complete this project. And by 2025, barely 6 years after that terrible night, the cathedral was ready to open its doors. Step inside now, and you'll see a building both ancient and renewed, carrying the weight, I think, of its scars, but also glowing with fresh light. Notre Dame has always been a work in progress, an ever-changing landscape of stone and spirit. And I think the fire, in many ways, was just another one of its chapters, and the restoration a reminder that Paris, I think, like its great cathedral, is one of the eternal cities. And here's the final point to grasp about Notre Dame. Nobody in the 12th century ever thought they were creating something medieval. The word Gothic was an insult coined later by people who thought the style barbaric compared to what was happening in Rome. If the original builders had been told to stick to the Romanesque, we might never have had the forest of pointed arches and stained glass that we see today. So every age actually remakes the past in its own image. Look at Notre Dame today. It's pale stone, its stripped down walls. That isn't what medieval worshippers knew. Their cathedral, as I mentioned, blazed with color. Murals gliding, painted saints and prophets, all designed to dazzle the eyes and instruct the faithful who could not read a word of Latin. It was never white and austere. It was always alive. But restoration in the 19th century chose a different vision. And that is the vision that we inherit. And I think perhaps also it's the lesson of Notre Dame. It's never belonged to a single age, a single faith, a single style. It has been Baroque. It has been revolutionary. It's been Gothic, romantic. It's been modern. It's been a Catholic shrine, a temple of reason, a national monument. In a country divided by monarchy, republic, religion, and revolution, I think Notre Dame somehow remained a quiet space for everyone. And maybe the greatest beauty of the restoration after the fire is not the spire or the roof, but the revival of crafts long forgotten. Stone carvers, glass makers, carpenters, artisans working with tools and skills that almost seemed lost in an industrial age. And they've been reborn in the service of this building. Notre Dame is as much a monument to them, to the living hands that shaped and reshaped it, as it is to kings and emperors. That, to me, is why the cathedral matters, not because it's frozen in some imagined original state, but because it continues to live. It carries the past, yes, but it also summons the present and points us towards the future. Since the restoration, Notre Dame, I think, has never looked better, and it was built faster than anyone thought possible, and it rose again. Step inside today, and it's breathtaking. It's lighter, it's clearer, the glass shining with a brilliance unseen in centuries, its stones washed clean. Outside, of course, the towers still rise proudly from the Ile de la Cité, the very heart of medieval Paris. There are few places on earth that let you stand so squarely in the middle of history. Thanks for listening in, folks. And look, if you visit Paris or the great cathedral of Notre Dame at any time of the year, not just summer, where I am now, you'll find it as beautiful as ever. Bye for now.